Hello again, and welcome to the Fountainhead discussion group being hosted by the Ayn Rand Institute. My name is Ben Baer. I'm a fellow and instructor at ARI. I'm going to be joined shortly by my colleague, Keith Lockitch. We are doing these discussion groups both because of the fact that the Fountainhead is a timeless novel that everybody should be discussing anyway, but also because we know many of you are at home looking for things to think about and learn about, and because we have an essay contest based on the Fountainhead, which I'll say something about in a moment. But first, let me say that if you are watching us on one of the social media channels, either YouTube or Facebook, that's one way to do this. But if you'd like to be able to interact with us during our session, if you'd like to be able to send us comments or questions, best way to do that is to view this through Zoom. And so I've put on the screen the URL for participating through Zoom. If you go to the courses.aynrand.org/webinars site, look up the Fountainhead Reading Group, you'll find a way to register for the Zoom webinar, and there you'll be able to interact with us. And yeah, a big part of the reason that we're doing this is because of our $10,000 prize essay contest. Deadline for which is May 28th. This group is scheduled to finish discussing the Fountainhead with about a week left in time for that deadline. So if you're interested in being a candidate for that prize money, please follow us along. And as always, consider downloading the Ayn Rand University app. This is the Institute's main digital platform for your smartphone, where we offer all kinds of free content, hours and hours of courses and lectures about Ayn Rand's philosophy. Okay, so Keith, I think, is going to join me in a second here, but if you're watching on Zoom, then the best way to participate with us is if you have a question that you want to ask, hover over your screen and you'll see a button at the bottom, which will bring out a Q&A module. Plug your questions into there. We will see them and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can if they're relevant to what we're discussing. There's a lot to discuss today, so I expect there will be a lot of questions. And I should mention we may hold some of these questions later for another session. Otherwise, you can also make comments in the chat box. If you hover over your screen, there's a chat button, and that's chat that you won't be able to chat with each other if you're an attendee, but we will see the things that you write in the chat. That's a good place to write comments. And when we ask you questions, if you want to offer your thoughts as to what the answers might be, another good thing to use the chat box for. So, Keith, are you out there?
Hi, Ben.
Hi.
Do you want to stop your screen share or you want to keep that up?
I can stop it.
Okay. So were you going to start by setting some context for what goes on?
Yeah, I can do that. And then I know you wanted to say some things after that. So we're at the point in the book, we're at the beginning of part 2. This is the part that's entitled Ellsworth M. Toohey. We are going to start to meet Toohey as a person for the first time in this section. More, I think, in the second half of part 2 than in the first half. So not so many of the things we're going to discuss are about Toohey today, but we'll touch on him a bit. The part and the first chapter begins with Rourke, who's just lost his last hope for a commission for the Manhattan Bank building because they wanted him to compromise his design. He's now taken a job in a quarry in Connecticut and living with that fact. Meanwhile, as it happens, Dominique, who we met briefly in previous chapters, also happens to be roughly in the same part of Connecticut. Her father happens to be the one who owns the very granite quarry that Rourke is going to work for. And she meets him one day at the quarry. They see each other. They then have a very controversial encounter, which is going to be the focus of much of our conversation today. But after that happens, Rourke returns to New York because he's finally been picked by Roger Enright to build a major new development, the Enright House. Meanwhile, we go back to the story of Toohey. Toohey is enjoying the success, the fruits, the rays of his Cosmos Lotnick building. There's a column that's written about him by Ellsworth Toohey. They actually meet. We meet Keating for the first time through his meeting with Keating, and Keating is then tapped by Toohey to be the head of this Council of American Builders, through which he's going to meet other renegade architects. We'll see more about that later. But Toohey at one point learns that Rourke, who he knew was the designer of the Enright House, of course, also knew Keating, and they grew up together and they lived in the same house. This is something that's rather surprising to Toohey. It's also surprising to Dominique to find out that Rourke is the architect of the Enright House, the guy that she met in the quarry. At this point, Dominique starts making some somewhat difficult to understand decisions, and we're gonna talk a lot about them. She, even though she is blown away by the house, she proceeds to criticize it in public and pan Rourke, and to try to take clients away from Rourke and send them to Keating, even as she begins a romantic affair with Rourke. And why the heck does she do that? That is something we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so let me jump in there. So this section of the book contains the very provocative and controversial sex scene involving Howard Roark and Dominique Franken. And I mean, this scene raises a lot of questions for people, understandably. So I think it's important that we spend quite a bit of time in today's session discussing various issues related to that scene, and more broadly to the characters of Rourke and Dominique and their relationship, and to try to make sense of what's going on there. It's very complex. So some of the discussion questions that we posted are meant to focus on these issues. So we're going to start with those questions and we'll see how far we get. We may not get to all the questions that we have today. Now, one of the things we want to talk about is, what was Ayn Rand's purpose in including a scene like this in the novel? And how did she intend the scene to be understood in the context of the novel? So she was asked about the meaning of this scene on a number of occasions, and she definitely intended it to be understood and interpreted a certain way. So I think to kick the discussion off today, I think that's a good place to start. I want to start by looking at how Rand herself viewed this scene and what she said about its meaning. And then we'll go into look at the questions and go into the novel and look for the evidence and arguments for that. So now the question that people ask about this scene is, the obvious question is this meant to be understood as a scene in which Rourke rapes Dominique? And if so, how is that consistent with Rand's philosophy, which is all about the respect for individual rights and the rejection of physical violence? Is there some contradiction going on here? Now, Rand was very adamant about how she viewed this scene. And she said explicitly on a number of occasions, she did not intend the scene to be understood as a rape scene. So in 1946, she was answering a letter from a fan. And what she said, I'll just quote from the letter that she wrote back to the fan. She said, quote, "Rourke did not actually rape Dominique. A man who would force himself on a woman against her wishes would be committing a dreadful crime. The lesson in the Rourke-Dominique romance is one of spiritual strength and self-confidence, not of physical violence," unquote. In another letter in 1965, where the person writing to her was asking the same question, she said, quote, "It was not an actual rape, but a symbolic action which Dominique all but invited. This was the action she wanted, and Howard Rourke knew it." Continuing the quote from Rand, "If you reread the passages pertaining to Dominique before and after the scene, you'll find many things to explain her motivation. Needless to say, an actual rape of an unwilling victim would be a vicious action and a violation of a woman's rights. In moral meaning, it would be the exact opposite of the scene in the Fountainhead," unquote. Okay, so that was Rand's view, both of the scene and of rape as a criminal act. So how are we to understand that? How are we to understand that she did not intend this scene to be viewed as a rape scene? Because on the other hand, it certainly looks a lot like a rape scene, and Dominique calls it an act of rape afterwards, right? So how are we to make sense of all of this? So I think that's the question that we want to keep on the top of mind as we start to go into the discussion questions and see how these relate to the question. Now, before we do that, I just want to make one general comment before we plunge in here. So we're talking here about Rand's intention for how the scene was meant to be understood. Now, you might disagree about whether the scene and the novel as written really does convey that intention. So you might disagree about whether or not Rand succeeded in her intention. Our goal for today is not necessarily to try to convince you one way or the other. What we want to do is we want to look at the evidence and we want to look at the arguments and put all those in front of you, and then you need to think about that for yourself. Okay, so that's what we're trying to accomplish here. So with that context in mind, let's start by looking at the first question that we posted for discussion. And the question that we posted is, why do you think Rourke and Dominique interact as they do when they first meet? Why in particular does Dominique react to her encounter with Rourke as she does? And just to put a question like for people to answer in the chat or in the Q&A panel, let me just, as part of this question that we want to look at is, what is it that's motivating Dominique? How do you understand Dominique's character and you know what seem like very complex motives? So if people want to go ahead and answer that in the chat or in the Q&A, what do you think? What's your understanding of Dominique and the things that are motivating her actions? What do people think of that?
I was certainly perplexed by her the first time I read this book. I did not understand what made her tick. And,
yeah,
after having read the book however many times now, when I go back and I reread it, I see all the clues being planted early in the story, but they're easy to miss if you're reading it for the first time, if you don't know to expect them.
Yeah. And so Dominique is a very complex character, and I think it is very difficult to understand her actions and motives. So I think it's worth spending a bit of time right off the bat talking about that a little bit and trying to look at the evidence that explains her motivation. So on the one hand, Dominique is an idealist, and she's somebody who understands and appreciates human greatness. So you think of the statue that she brought back from Europe, the statue of Helios, the sun god, right? And think about the way she evaluates the Enright house the first time she sees it. She thinks it's an absolutely beautiful building. So she's somebody who has the capacity to understand and appreciate human greatness, right? But on the other hand, she also has a kind of all-encompassing pessimism about the world. So she has a worship of ability and integrity, but at the same time, she's convinced that ability and integrity are doomed to destruction in a world that's dominated and ruled by mediocrity. So she has this beautiful statue, but she doesn't want anybody else to see it. She doesn't want it to be part of the world that she views as being ruled by mediocrity. And so this is why she destroys. So she brings this beautiful statue home, and then she throws it down the air shaft to destroy it, right? How do you make sense of that, right? So the essence of Dominique's character is that she's torn by this internal conflict between her worship of human greatness and her conviction that greatness is doomed in the world as it is. And there's actually, Ben, is it worth saying something a little bit about how about the philosophy of Stoicism and how that plays into this? Do you want to say a little bit about the idea? So the idea that we don't want to be tied to the world by our values. This is part of what she says to Alva Scarrett in her conversation with him in part 1 of the book.
Yeah, the line that she gives Scarrett about how what she wants is freedom, to expect nothing, to depend on nothing. That's reminiscent of classical Stoicism, which says the reason that people are unhappy in the world is because they desire too many things. Their desires are frustrated, and because there's no way to predict whether you're going to be able to get what you want. And so the best way to be happy is to not suffer. And the best way to not suffer is to not pursue too many values in the world.
Yeah.
And so we get this stereotype of the Stoic sage who is aloof and above the concerns of the world, and isn't then affected when painful things happen.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think Dominique's a lot like that.
So notice what she says. So the first time she sees the drawings of the Enright house, notice what she says. This is on page 244 of the novel. She's talking to Ellsworth Toohey. She says, "I think the man who designed this should have committed suicide. A man who conceived a thing as beautiful as this should never allow it to be erected. Why? Why shouldn't something, if he can conceive of something beautiful, why should he never allow it to be erected?" She says, "He should not want it to exist, but he will let it be built so that women will hang out diapers on his terraces, so that men will spit on his stairways and draw dirty pictures on his walls. He's given it to them and he's made it part of them." So she's saying he's defiled his own work. He's committed a sacrilege by bringing it into the world in which mediocrity dominates. So it's this conflict that she feels. She doesn't want to have any important values that will tie her to the world. She resists and struggles against any personal desires or values because she fears that she will see them be destroyed. So this is her mindset. This is her kind of psychology and what's her basic motive in this conflict that she's torn by. And then she meets Howard Rourke. So
I just want to add to that, Keith, that to qualify what I said about Stoicism. I mean, the Stoicism, the view of hers that's similar to Stoicism is one half of that conflict that you mentioned before. It's the kind of pessimistic half of the conflict. But you wouldn't ordinarily think of her character as a whole as Stoic, because there's this other big half, the part that makes her an impassioned idealist who, even when she's doing kind of Stoic things that are meant to quash her desires, she does them in a incredibly dramatic way. Like, it's not that she's sitting around doing yoga all day just trying to appreciate little things, and she couldn't if she tried. And some of the people in the chat are remarking on some things that are relevant here. So Keith, a different Keith, said she seems like she enjoys being made uncomfortable and put in painful situations. That's a result of the kind of conflict that we're talking about here, I think. Gretchen says that she doesn't think that Dominique understands herself. She's attracted to Rourke because he's unafraid of her, because she sees his strength. How can she not know what she values in him? Ellen says she's sexually awakened, and she also finds something she wants in Rourke, thus it frightens her when she becomes obsessed. So
okay,
it's also worth.
You wanted to say a little about the scenes kind of leading up to their time when they first meet and so on.
Yeah, the beginning of chapter 1, I've always thought, is very well crafted in the same way that much of the beginning of part 1 of the book is, because the author here is setting things up in a way that draws very careful comparisons and contrasts between Rourke and Dominique. So first of all, they're both in the same place. They've both gone to Connecticut. They're both near this quarry. And in the first 2 scenes, you get pictures of them doing basically the same things. They're both eating. They're at the kitchen. They're taking baths. They're feeling the earth beneath them. They're looking up at the trees and the light shining through the green leaves. But the way each of them is portrayed as doing this is interestingly different, and I think speaks to the kind of characterological difference that you've been pointing to. So, for instance, when Rourke is lying on the ground looking in the trees, page 202, he would roll over on his back and lie still, feeling the warmth of the earth under him. Far above, the leaves were still green, but it was a thick, compressed green, as if the color were condensed in one last effort before the dusk coming to dissolve it. And then a little later, the earth resisted, but it gave way. It was a silent victory. He felt a dim, sensuous pleasure in the muscles of his legs. Okay, so that's Rourke's attitude toward the earth and the tree. Here's Dominique's on page 204. She saw clouds swimming behind the leaves. It looked as if a giant tree before her were moving, slanting, ready to fall and crush her. She stopped. She waited, her head thrown back, her throat pulled tight. She felt as if she wanted to be crushed. Then she fell down on her back and lay still, her arms and legs flung out like a cross on the ground, breathing in release, feeling empty and flattened, feeling the weight of the air like a pressure against her breasts. And that feeling empty and flattened sensation is going to come up one more time in this.
Well, and it's interesting that Rourke is basically doing a convict's labor in a granite quarry, and yet he feels he kind of revels in these feelings in the air. You know, he feels a sensuous pleasure, and whereas Dominique is, you know,
chatelaine of the countryside.
Chatelaine of the countryside. She's the little empress, sort of, and yet she feels like she's about to be crushed and flattened. Yeah. It's so that's interesting. So if we think about what we just talked about Dominique's characterization, this internal conflict that she's torn by, I think we can use that to understand how she reacts the first time she sees Howard Rourke in the quarry. So I'm going to read this quote, and then I want to talk about the different elements in here. So this is the paragraph on page 205 where she first sees Howard Rourke. She saw his mouth and the silent contempt in the shape of his mouth, the planes of his gaunt, hollow cheeks, the cold, pure brilliance of the eyes that had no trace of pity. She knew it was the most beautiful face she would ever see, because it was the abstraction of strength made visible. She felt a convulsion of anger, of protest, of resistance, and of pleasure. He stood looking up at her. It was not a glance, but an act of ownership. She thought that she must let her face give him the answer he deserved, but she was looking instead at the stone dust on his burned arms, the wet shirt clinging to his ribs, the lines of his long legs. She was thinking of those statues of men she had always sought. She was wondering what he would look like naked. She saw him looking at her as if he knew that. She thought she had found an aim in life, a sudden sweeping hatred for that man. Now just think about all the different elements and conflicting elements that are packed into that one paragraph, right? It's the most beautiful face she would ever see. He makes her think of the statues of Greek gods. She wonders what he looks like naked. And at the same time, she feels anger, protest, resistance, right? A sudden sweeping hatred for that man. So how do you explain all these different components? Well, it comes down to this basic conflict, internal conflict that we just talked about. At first glance, she is immediately, passionately attracted to Rourke. Okay, so at the first sight of him, she feels this intense physical attraction, right? So why does she feel anger, protest, resistance, hatred? Well, it's precisely because she doesn't want to want anything, right? She doesn't want any ties to the world. So she feels this incredible attraction, and that flies in the face of her desire to not have any ties to the world, to have any values, because she's afraid of seeing them get destroyed in the world. So this is incredibly complex mixture of emotional reactions that comes as a result of this incredible internal conflict that she's torn by. So that's her immediate reaction. And already we see that there's a lot of complex things going on here. And then they start to have some interactions and they start to have some conversations. And I think some of those conversations also shed light on her motives and on Rourke's reaction to her and what he understands about her motives. Did you want to jump in on any of this?
Well,
Ben?
did you want to do the fireplace first before?
Well, I think it's important. There's some conversations that they have before the fireplace um, that shed light on how much Rourke understands about her motivation. So,
You're talking about the why do you always stare at me?
yeah.
And he
So
says, for the
page
same reason you've
207.
been staring at me. She says, I don't know what you're talking about. He says, if you didn't, you'd be much more astonished and much less angry, Miss Franken, which I've always thought is both moderately humorous, but more interestingly, it's now Rourke is the one who's making the sort of aloof comments about people's motivation for saying things, which is what Dominique used to do. And so it shows you he's sort of got the upper hand conversationally, and she doesn't deny what he says there either. Just comments on how do you know my name?
And she says, since you know who I am, it would be better if you stopped looking at me when I come here. It might be misunderstood. And he says, I don't think so. So there's clearly an understanding that they have about each other. And we could talk later about Ayn Rand's view of as a literary artist, what she puts into her novels about how much people can understand just by looking at each other, which is part of her literary style. But let's not get into that now. I think we can come back to that later.
Ellen in the chat says that she thinks the quarry scene in the movie is one of the best scenes in the movie. I don't know if you agree, Keith, but I tend to agree with that. And I think the exchange between Gary Cooper and Patricia Neal in these very scenes, these very lines are some of the best ones there. So if you're curious to see how this might get acted out, check that out.
Yeah, so Roark and Dominique have a number of interactions, conversations in the quarry, and if you read those carefully, there's definitely the implication that Rourke has that Dominique clearly shows her attraction to Rourke, and Rourke has an understanding of her motives and so on. So then Dominique sort of contrives to have Rourke come to fix the marble in her fireplace, and even the way this whole thing is set up is very, she hits it as hard as she can, and all she succeeds in doing is making a little scratch in it. And so Rourke comes, she asks him if he'll come to do some dirty work at her place and fix the marble. And he looks and he can see immediately she just made this little scratch, and with one blow, boom! Now it's broken and has to be fixed.
No. Now it's broken and has to be replaced. Is the way it has to be delivered, because he's saying wasn't broken before and I know it.
It wasn't broken before and I know it, and you know that I know it. You know that I know it, and clearly this is all contrived. And then I won't go into all the detail, but if you look at their conversation about the marble, I mean, it's full of kind of sexual double entendre, the infiltration of foreign elements from the soil. We don't need to go into
pressure
all
has consequences.
Pressure, yeah.
Be contained.
Exactly. So there's all this, laden kind of language between them. So by this point in their interaction, I think at least what Rand's intention is that Rourke is pretty certain that Dominique is sexually attracted to him and wants him, and what he does is he decides to test her because he wants to be sure, right? And so instead of going to set the marble himself, what does he do? He sends Pasquale Orsini from the quarry to go and do the repair instead. And then, if she didn't have any feelings for Rourke at all, it wouldn't matter, right? It wouldn't matter who comes to set the marble. But this sends her into a rage, and she confronts him. She's riding on her horse with a whip in her hand, or a piece of stick, a twig, and she asks him. She's clearly enraged by this. Why didn't you come to set the marble? And he says, I didn't think it would make any difference who came, or does it? And so this is when she whips him in the face, showing that it clearly did matter. She wanted to see him. She wanted him to come, and the fact that he didn't sets her off, on this rage. Go ahead, Ben. You look like you want to say something.
Not anything particular about that, but it is interesting. They've each done, in effect, a little experiment. She by breaking the fireplace to make him come, and then he by not coming the second time to be the one to replace it. And they've each gotten the results of this experiment. But then the big scene happens. The very controversial scene happens. And he comes to her room and he opens the door. And what's interesting on this latest rereading of mine is the way it's described. I mean, you get why it's controversial, but part of what makes it difficult to understand is that it's paradoxically presented. So right at the beginning, we're told that she doesn't know, this is page 216, she doesn't know whether she twists her body to escape or lays still in his arms. Mm-hmm. She does try to tear herself away. She beats him with her fists. She escapes. He takes her again. She fights like an animal, but she does not call for help. And that's even though there's servants and the like in her house. She sees him as doing this as an act of scorn against her, but then we're told that this is what makes her lie still and submit to it. And we're told if he had been kind, if he had been passionate, then she would have reacted coldly to this whole thing. And we know that she's done this before. Anytime anyone's tried to touch her, when Keating tried to touch her, that she would just be indifferent and cold. And we're told she wants to be taken contemptuously. That's page 217. And then at the end, she ends up feeling empty, light, and flat, which is the same way that she was described with the tree. She wants to take a bath, but then she decides she's not going to take a bath. She wants to keep the traces of him on her body.
Yeah, so I think again, it's if you understand the way Dominique is characterized as being torn by this internal conflict, I think there's an argument that this scene plays out kind of in the only way it possibly could. She desperately wants Rourke and she takes pleasure in the act, but because of her internal conflict, she doesn't want that kind of tie to the world. She doesn't want to have values in the world that she fears are going to be destroyed. So she's fighting against it. She's fighting internally against her own desire. And that manifests itself as fighting against him in this scene. She fights him as a way of fighting her own desire, which she fears and resists. And we're told that afterwards, she had found pleasure in the thing which had happened, that he had known it, and more, that he had known it before he came to her, and that he would not have come but for that knowledge. So that's Rand characterizing the intention of the scene there.
So did you want to say anything more about the passages from those letters that Rand wrote, or would you like me to start to wrap this question?
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the way that I so apart from some of the things that I just mentioned, I can see other reasons why this is such a controversial scene. I mean, I think there's good questions that you can ask about. You had made this distinction earlier, Keith, about how, well, there's what the author intended, and then there's the question of whether what she portrayed achieved her intention. And yeah, there's questions you can ask about whether a scene that unfolded like this in reality would or wouldn't count as rape in spite of the author's intentions. I mean, it's true that she never calls out for help, but she also never gives what they call affirmative consent. She does fight him physically. Now, they thought about these things very differently in the 1940s. They had different conventions and understandings for what counted as consent even. And, when this scene came out, the reason that it was controversial was because it was sex, that it was just any kind of sex. They weren't even to the point of thinking of getting into a big controversy. Was it consensual sex or not? This is way before the Me Too era. So, I know people who stopped reading the book when they got to this scene. And I can kind of get that. But it's definitely relevant to understand, the time in which it's written, what the author is trying to achieve with it. I remember that there was and this is a relevant data point as well. I remember somebody asked Ayn Rand a question once in a Q&A session at a lecture, asking, where do you come up with the ideas for your love scenes? And she said, wishful thinking. I don't know if she had that in mind in particular with this particular scene, but it's
but
a lot going on here.
I think it's also important to note that this is a novel, and it's a stylized presentation of the relationship. I don't think there's any intention that this is meant to be interpreted as sort of a manual or a guidebook for how people should engage in their interactions literally.
Yeah.
And she includes a lot about, we get the author's view, the bird's eye view of each of their thoughts and feelings, and they are able to, or she projects into the novel an ability for them to understand people's intentions and thoughts much more explicitly than you would be able to in real life. She even has in this section of the book, she has Ellsworth Toohey talk about how the importance of a first glance at a person's face. Now, normally the things that Toohey says are not expressing Ayn Rand's views, right? Because he's a villain in the novel. But I think this is one case where he is expressing something that she holds. He says, this is on page 264. He says, there's nothing as significant as a human face, nor as eloquent. We can never really know another person except by our first glance at him, because in that glance, we know everything. So I think there's a way in which there's a projection here that in these implicit and nonverbal ways, Rourke and Dominique understand each other, which in real life would not be the case. And the other thing I think is important to note is that portraying Dominique's character in this conflicted way, and including this scene in the novel, there are important reasons why this is necessary for the plot and for the development of the themes and for the story that she wants to tell. Let me just say a couple sentences about that. I think part of what she's portraying in the novel, I think we've seen enough to know that the story of the Fountainhead is the story of Howard Rourke's struggle to succeed as an architect, to succeed as this. So we see that clearly he's a creative genius, and he's fighting against the opposition of the architectural profession, of critics, of all of society sort of set against him. And part of what Rand is doing as a literary artist is she's trying to heighten the drama and the tension in the story as much as possible. So what better way can you heighten the drama and the tension so you have a story of a man who's fighting all obstacles in order to succeed. And one of the things that he has to fight against is the opposition of the woman he loves and who loves him. So the only way she can accomplish that is by having Dominique embody this internal conflict, which puts her in a position of both loving him and fighting against him. So it's partly to heighten the dramatic tension in the story that she's including all of this stuff.
And it also brings out something about Rourke's character by contrast, because both Rourke and Dominique are passionate idealists. the author once described the character of Dominique as herself in a bad mood. And so you can see that there's a commonality between Rourke and Dominique, but they differ in this one crucial respect, which is whether they see the achievement of their ideals in reality as possible. And then, well, what difference does that make for their action? And then what does it look like when they get together? And they're obviously going to be attracted, but they're also going to be repulsed in a different way. So that character difference will have important implications for the plot. And this is where that starts. And Bonnie was just asking about Dominique as myself in a bad mood. Yes, she did. She did say that.
Okay.
We should do that poll, Keith, before we do anything more?
Yeah, so
because
go ahead.
We wanted to find out, we've in the past asked people's level of experience or familiarity with Ayn Rand, but especially now that we're this far into our session, we'd like to get a slightly finer grained look at your knowledge of this book. Are you reading it for the first time? Are you rereading it? Are you reading it? Are you participating in the series without reading it? That's option 3. And then maybe there's a few people out there who've never read it, aren't reading it, and are still listening in. And if you're in Zoom, please respond to that poll. We're getting some good numbers coming in already. Thanks for that. And I'll leave this open for a while if you're on Zoom, and you can fill that out as we are beginning to discuss question 2. And question 2, I don't think we need to spend as much time on, Keith, but we can at least make 1 or 2 important points about it, because there's a lot of connections between it and the one we just discussed, which was, why does Dominique work so actively to sabotage Rourke's career while simultaneously maintaining this secret love affair with him? And the love affair begins almost as soon as Rourke and Dominique meet again, after she finds out that he's the architect who built this Enright house, which she had previously seen pictures of, which she admired. And
I think can I just jump in there? Because I think it's worth stressing this point. So when she meets Rourke in the quarry, she thinks he's a quarry worker, and her attraction to him is based on something that she sees in him, but it's almost just a physical, it's a purely physical thing. She doesn't know anything about who he actually is. When she discovers that he's the architect, that the same guy who's she's incredibly attracted to is the architect who designed the Enright house, which is the most beautiful thing she's seen. This makes her conflict even worse, right? Not only, so it's not just a man that she's physically attracted to, he's also a creative genius capable of bringing works of human greatness into the world. So being torn by this conflict as she is, this is an even worse position for her to be in. So go ahead.
Right. So you start to see indications of the same kind of conflict in her first reactions to this building. So she writes a column panning it, although if you read it between the lines, it's actually giving it compliments. By creating the contrast, it will have made itself a part of the great ineptitude, its most ludicrous part. If a ray of light falls into a pigsty, it is the ray that shows us the muck, and it is the ray that is offensive. So she's calling this building a ray of light, and her objection is that it makes the rest of the pigsty of the world quite evident. And she says similar things when she's trying to then take clients away from Rourke and send them to Keating. But she gives an explicit explanation for why she's doing what she's doing to Rourke on the night they begin, the night they initiate their affair. She says, "I hate you for what you are, for wanting you, for having to want you. I'm going to fight you, and I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to pray that you can't be destroyed. but I will fight to block every step you take. I will fight to tear every chance you want away from you. I have done it to you today, and that's why I shall sleep with you tonight. So if you made the point before, Keith, that when she saw him for the first time in the quarry, that he reminded her of those statues of Greek gods. Well, here it's important to remember what she did with those statues. She threw them out down the air shaft to destroy them. And so it seems like the parallels here too. She wants to destroy him because she wants to be free of desire for him in a world where she thinks he'll be destroyed, and in a world that doesn't deserve to see him in the first place. Though here again, especially in that passage that I just read, you get the sense that she's also doing another test. She's also doing another experiment because, yeah, she's going to try to destroy him, but she's praying that he can't be destroyed, which suggests, well, maybe if in spite of all of her best efforts, he can't be destroyed, there's something wrong with her view that the world is always going to destroy people like this. And maybe she needs to reevaluate her perspective.
But at the same time, that view is what's driving her. And I think it's important to point out that notice how all of this unfolds. And I think it's also important to look at Ellsworth Toohey's role in this, because Ellsworth Toohey, so after she meets Rourke at Kiki Holcomb's party and realizes that he's the designer of the Enright house, right? So she feels this incredible conflict. Toohey comes to her office, and what does he do? He paints a picture. So remember, her conflict is that she's convinced that greatness is doomed to destruction in the world that's dominated by mediocrity. And she can't bear to see that happen, and she'd rather destroy it herself than watch it have a long, drawn-out, painful demise.
It's like a mercy killing.
Yeah, a mercy killing, exactly. So remember what Toohey does on page 268. He informs her about Rourke's past and the fact that he and Keating started out together at Stanton and have sort of these parallel careers. And he paints a vivid picture for her of what he projects the future will hold for Rourke, which is total defeat and failure, while at the same time, Keating, who Dominique views as a mediocre architect, is achieving every possible success the world has to offer. And he paints this vivid picture of what it will feel like for Rourke to be beaten by Peter Keating. And this sends her, you see how she reacts to this on that page. She stands up and she screams at him, "Get out of here." But notice what she does. It's immediately after that scene painted for her by Ellsworth Toohey that she goes to take away Rourke's first commission. She goes to Joel Sutton, who has this building, and he's almost decided that he's going to give it to Rourke, and she convinces him not to do it. This is what sets her off. This vision of Rourke being defeated by the world is what drives her, impels her to fight against him so that she doesn't have to watch that happening. So I think this is how we're meant to understand her character and how we can understand the things that she does. It all comes down to the fact that her essence is that she's torn by this internal conflict.
So that scene on page 268 that you mentioned with his description of how Rourke could be made to suffer and her reaction to it is a good segue to getting into question 3. And we probably won't get into question 4 today, but that's okay. I think we can spend the time we need on 3. When this was, what is similar and different about Toohey's and Dominique's reactions to Rourke? So let me say a few things about Toohey, and then I think the conclusions to be drawn about the comparisons between the two of them will be pretty obvious, especially since we've already said a lot about Dominique. So very early on, Toohey expresses ignorance about Rourke when it's clear that he isn't really ignorant. Keating asks if he's heard of him, if he knows about the Enright House, and he pretends not to care about it, but it's clear shortly after that he does, because he starts asking all of these questions of Keating when he finds out that Keating and Rourke were once roommates. They went to school together. They've known each other for a long time. He wants to know more about his personal habits, his beliefs, his motives, his attitude, especially his attitude toward his work. And then a little bit later, at the Kiki Holcomb party, where both Toohey and Rourke are present, Toohey cannot stop paying attention to Rourke. And the way that the nature of the attention that he gives him is probably revealing of something which we'll have to follow later. But he says he looked at the man as he looked occasionally at the pavement from a window on the 30th floor, wondering about his own body were it to be hurled down and what would happen when it struck against that pavement. That's 262. He says he doesn't want to meet Rourke when he's offered the opportunity, even though he's conscious of no one else at the party. And then 263, we get, he did not want to look at Rourke. He had to look, just as he always had to look down at the distant pavement, dreading the sight. So it's like what they call the car crash value, that you're gapers on the highway. Why is it that Rourke threatens Toohey in this way? Well, you get a sense of it. You get a sense of why. Then at the end of chapter, well, it's in the middle of chapter 8 on page 281, where he's again having another conversation with Dominique. And this is right after they form this kind of alliance. And Toohey looks out at the city and he says, this is a sublime achievement, a heroic achievement. Think of the thousands who work to create this and the millions who profit by it. As it said, but for the spirit of a dozen men here and down the ages, but for a dozen men less perhaps, none of this would have been possible. And that might be true. If so, there are two possible attitudes to take. We can say these 12 were great benefactors, that we all are fed by the overflow of the magnificent wealth of their spirit, and that we are glad to accept it in gratitude and brotherhood. Or we can say that by the splendor of their achievement, which we can neither equal nor keep, these 12 have shown us what we are, that we do not want the free gifts of their grandeur, that a cave by an oozing swamp and a fire of sticks rubbed together are preferable to skyscrapers and neon lights, if the cave and the sticks are the limit of our own creative capacities. Of the two attitudes, Dominique, which would you call the truly humanitarian one? Because you see, I'm a humanitarian. And, well, we know that he feels threatened in some way by Rourke. He feels like he would smash up against the pavement of Rourke. It's hard to imagine at this point that what he feels is the gratitude and brotherhood for the magnificent wealth of Rourke's spirit, that instead it's something else. And, well, he's described what the something else is. Interesting that he would regard that as the humanitarian view, if that is indeed what he's implying.
Mm-hmm. Now, so what's interesting is that Dominique, who also sees the greatness that Rourke represents, comes to a similar view of in terms of how she wants to respond to that, but for very opposite reason. So Toohey, in some ways, is afraid of what Rourke represents because of what it implies about himself, whereas Dominique is afraid of seeing Rourke destroyed by the world. And so, you know, they what does Toohey say, that they come from opposite poles? Where we start from opposite poles, but that makes no difference because we meet in the same point.
Which Dominique is taken aback by, because he's saying all these things recognizing who Rourke is and what he's accomplished. And she says, if you can see what you're talking about, you can't be what you are. And he says, no, I must be what I am precisely because of what I see. And she thinks this makes him much worse than she had even thought. So, and yet she's willing to do this alliance with him. And Gretchen had submitted us a question about why she's willing to enter into this pact with him. She does consider him an enemy who has to be watched, or rather she's saying, does she consider him an enemy who has to be watched, or does she underestimate him, or something else? I think that's a good question, and one that I don't know if we have the full answer to just yet.
Yeah.
It's not only that she has to watch Toohey, because the alliance is not just to be there to watch, it's to actually send clients from Rourke to Keating. It's actually, she says she wants to destroy Rourke. Now there's a question about why she wants to do that. And we've talked about some of her motivations, and they are different. They're certainly different than Toohey's. So if what Dominique is doing is killing or trying to kill Rourke, it's more in the nature of a kind of mercy killing. Whereas the way that Toohey's been describing what he wants to do, it's sadistic.
Yeah. Now, Sam in the chat asks a question: why do Howard Rourke's clients continually fail to recognize his greatness? So that's an interesting question, because if you look at all the people that Dominique goes to where she convinces them not to go with Rourke, but to go with Peter Keating, you can ask the question, are they really Rourke's kind of people? Remember way back at the beginning of the novel when Rourke is talking to the dean and he says, think about the clients, and Rourke says that he needs to find his kind of people. The clients who want what he has to offer will come to him, right? So if you think about someone like a Joel Sutton, if he can be convinced, if he's so concerned with what other people think that he can be convinced by Dominique not to go with Howard Rourke, is he really, a Rourke's kind of person? Ask yourself this question. Do you think Dominique could have convinced Austin Heller not to use Rourke as his architect? Could she have convinced Roger Enright not to use Rourke as his architect? I think the answer there is obvious. There's no way that would have worked. And I think there's a way that Rourke understands that. And the people that she's taking away from him are people that, it's dubious whether they really understand and appreciate what he has to offer in the first place.
In many cases, all that Dominique is doing is reporting facts. You don't, the conversation with Joel Sutton, well, you don't see a lot of other people going to Rourke, do you? She even says it'll be a great building, but says, well, you don't really want a great building, do you, Joel? You want something comfortable and folksy and safe.
And she doesn't even say the name Peter Keating. She lets him, who's
everybody going
person everybody's talking about? Oh, Peter Keating. Oh, right, Joel, Peter Keating.
So she's just allowing their prejudices to play their natural course. It would only be if someone tried very hard to push them in the opposite direction that they would actually change their minds. And she's not doing that for them. Rourke himself, remember, had said going to these kinds of parties where the Joel Suttons of the world hang out don't ever really work for him anyway. He only went to get the tux, out of protest when Roger Enright
made him
asked him to do it. He and Austin Heller. And of course, the way that he gets Enright is an example of what you're talking about, right? So he had tried to get through Enright through his secretary. The secretary is very conventional, doesn't bother giving him much of an interview. It's only when Enright goes around seeing the buildings that Rourke has already put up that he's convinced. He says, I saw your buildings in the note that he sent to Rourke, and fires the secretary.
So I think just to plant a question here for people to think about as you continue reading the novel, are we seeing again an example of Rourke being kind of sacrificing himself for the sake of his artistic integrity, or is something else going on? Is it the fact that Dominique can take all these clients away because Rourke is so uncompromising? Is that what does that imply about, whether integrity is practical, and what does that imply about Rourke? These questions that we've raised in previous sessions. Is this an example of Rourke being selfless and sacrificing himself for his art?
And
We're
on that
not going to
note,
talk about that now, but it's something to think about, and we'll talk about it in future sessions.
on that note, Keith, I thought maybe we'll go out with this,
Okay.
since we're at time. You asked this question about what does this imply about Rourke's integrity, about whether he's being selfish. There's an interesting passage when Dominique is visiting the Enright, the construction site for the Enright house, where we get further thought on this issue. Top of page 287. She thought, standing here in the heart of the building, that if she had nothing of him, nothing but his body, here it was, offered to her, the rest of him, to be seen and touched, open to all. The girders and the conduits and the sweeping reaches of space were his, and could not have been anyone else's in the world. His face, his face, as his soul. Here was the shape he had made, and the thing within him which had caused him to make it. The end and the cause together, the motive power eloquent in every line of steel, a man's self, hers for this moment, hers by grace of her seeing it and understanding. And so if that is both, well, if that's even Dominique's understanding of what a man's self is, or what an expression of a man's self is, what does that imply about the author's estimate of Rourke's self and what it means, and whether he counts as a lover of self or not? Okay, so thanks everyone, and I'll just quickly remind you that we are going to be doing the second half of part 2 next week. That's chapters 9 through 15, pages 293 to 389. And we're looking forward again to seeing you all there. So same time, same place next week. Signing off.
Thank you.